principal of Soloman ETC, an architecture and urban design firm. His firm has won 73 design awards, including 4 Progressive Architecture Awards, 3 Charter Awards from the Congress for the New Urbanism, national awards from the American Institute of Architects and the American Planning Association, and 2 awards from the Housing and Urban Development Department of the United States government for design excellence. He's also co-founder of the Congress for the New Urbanism, and he's found time to write 3 very good books: Rebuilding in 1992, Global City Blues in 2003, and in 2008, Cosmopolis. I'm not sure how he finds time to do all of that. And in 2004, he won the Mabeck Award, the AIA California Chapter's honor award for continued distinguished excellence among architects in the state of California. But beyond these accomplishments, I consider Dan a great mentor. In fact, in one of my first classes at the University of California, Berkeley, that I took with Dan on architectural theory, he rolled out a set of construction documents, and instead of talking theory first, he talked about the challenges of practice. And then he discussed the importance of theory. Well, I was hooked that night, as I'm sure you'll be hooked tonight. With that, please welcome Dan Soloman.
Thank you, Mark, with your usual hyperbole. I taught at Berkeley for a long time. And in that time, I learned about 2 of the most excruciating forms of human experience. One is the faculty meeting, and the other is the architectural lecture. Since I've never been a dean or a department chair, I've never even tried to figure out how to make faculty meetings endurable. But the inherent structural tedium of architectural lectures is a topic I have wrestled with many times with mixed results. The point of an architectural lecture is usually to show some projects that one has been working on and then try to convince an audience that they're good. One trick in doing that seems to be not getting to the point for a long time. And that's the trick that I'm going to try tonight. I'm going to show some projects, and I'm going to try to convince you that they're pretty good. But first, I want to lead you on a wayward narrative that goes all around the world and forward and backward in time in order to set the frame for these projects and what I and my colleagues are trying to do with them. First, I want to talk a little bit about how cities grow. City growth is an inescapable fact of life in the 21st century. It will shape all of your careers as it has mine. City growth has been a fact of life for about 2 centuries. And if growth is inevitable for most cities, the form that growth takes is not inevitable. I'd like to argue that there are 3 main ways in which cities can grow. There's some exceptions to this, but there's basically 3 ways that cities can transform themselves and grow. Cities can sprawl and decentralize, or cities can erase themselves and build anew, or cities can regenerate themselves more densely within their own structure. In most cases, the path, which of these 3 paths cities follow, is a matter of public policy. It's a choice. It's a collective choice that people make. It's not the workings of some mysterious historical process. Sprawl and erasure were the dominant modes of urban growth chosen almost everywhere, that is almost everywhere but Portland, in the last half of the 20th century. Both of these ways of city building were promulgated with such force and with economic and cultural roots that were so deep and effects that were so lasting and so pernicious that each has generated an entire literature, almost an entire culture of counter-polemic. Large numbers of people in much of the world have learned to hate sprawl. large numbers of people have learned to hate the erasure of historic cities and historic architecture. The only way that I ever get anything written is by obligating myself to give lectures. So this is really a kind of trial balloon for a book that I'm in the early stages of at least trying to write. The subject of this book is the third way of city building: reconstruction and expansion within the basic form, if not the physical boundaries of existing cities. The argument for this way of city building, the third way, acquires force when it is compared to the utter uselessness of the other two models for the rocky road and the calamitous beginnings of the 21st century that we've been living through and are living through right at the moment. There's absolutely no one on earth who argues any longer that the mid-20th century automobile-dominated city of sprawl is a good thing, or that it represents a sensible strategy for the times that lie ahead and for the times of your careers. Erasure, on the other hand, is somewhat different, because the brutal urban strategies of clearance and reconstruction that failed so colossally, so spectacularly a generation ago, seem never quite to go away. The ringing polemics that had such force in the 1930s seem to ring on and on, with wave after wave of crazy people proposing, celebrating, sometimes even building the very things that the world learned to despise 40 years ago. The deepest and most tenaciously defended bunkers of erasure planning are set in schools of architecture. I think not this one. But from these bunkers, a worldwide conspiracy, faculty people, communicates in the secret codes of critical theory. Gibberish to the ears of most people, but like other forms of jive talk, a language of cultural sustenance for those who speak it. I know in a school of architecture I should be careful about what I say, because there may be even some theory jive speakers in this very room. Who knows? What neither sprawl builders now going broke out in the suburbs, the hermetic architecture professors in their bunkers, nor much of the American Congress debating stimulus spending have come to terms with, is that we are at the beginning of a time of radical and involuntary change. Like it or not, we face the complete retooling of American industry, the American landscape, and the American city to equip our society for the age after oil. There's no choice. The post-oil economy and the post-oil city are upon us, with effects as profound for the 21st century as railroads were for the 19th, or the automobile was for the 20th century. There's no question that zooming around on freeway ramps in a nice handling car was and is great fun. But it's something to look back on fondly, if you're like me and like doing that sort of thing. But it's not something to look forward to. But what we can look forward to may not be so bad. If we do things right, most of us will be healthy and fit well into our advanced years, our days filled with exercise and with yummy fresh food. Eugene, where Steve Prefontaine occupies a special place in local history, may have been ahead of the rest of the world in that regard. In times to come, people in many places may be able to walk from one thing to another. More of us may have workplaces in which we breathe fresh air and know the seasons from the nuances of light in our workplace. And our frantic preoccupations with the production and the consumption of goods may calm down to the point where that some of us may from time to time read or write or think. The 21st century of our dreams will be new. The 21st century city of our dreams will be new, but not altogether new. Many parts of it will be like things used to be before the onslaughts of sprawl and erasure. But what will be new is our ways of making cities and the rules and the policies that govern their making. We need to assemble a body of knowledge that is fundamentally different from the knowledge that I was trained with, that my generation of 20th century city builders operated by. It's why goings-on in schools of architecture and town planning are important, and it's why writing and criticism, I think, are important. Let me talk for just a minute about this new little book that I'm trying to write and its audience. Most books on architecture fall into one of two categories. Some books are monographs that document the work of an architect. The other kind, the second more complex category, is what one might call real books. Mark just wrote a real book. That is, books about ideas that are augmented by illustrations of architecture. Monographs are inevitably tinted with an element of self-promotion. But real books, however partisan they might be, present themselves as discourse and not as advertising. There's an unwritten rule in architectural publishing never to mix the two genres and thereby confuse discourse with marketing. That's a confusion I think many readers find irritating and publishers think of as poison for selling books. But the new little book that I want to write will break publishing's miscegenation laws about the cross-breeding of monographs and real books. And my new little book will also argue that subject matter, which has heretofore been considered the exclusive domain of a very geeky few, should now be a required course for everyone. It will make the claim that what I and my colleagues in our office have been up to for much of the recent past is something that people who care about cities, students especially, should care about and know about. We may be delusional or self-aggrandizing in this, but you as students are in a position to decide. Our subject is the urban block, its history and our own attempts to contribute to its evolution. The block, this little book will claim, is the underlying DNA of the city, and it's more than that. The formation of urban blocks both reflects and shapes the very structure of society. The eternal lament of architects and planners that they're prisoners of forces larger than themselves, that they don't really control anything, does not apply completely to the urban block. The urban block is the scale at which those of us who do nothing more than design can have some real effect on the way things are and the way people live. Unlike individual buildings, which are the monomaniacal focus of almost all architects, blocks are not the passive victim of whatever is around them. Unlike buildings, blocks do not depend on the decontextualizing of the photograph to be of interest or to communicate their intent. There's probably not an architect on earth, me included, who has never cropped a photograph of his work. Cropping the image of a building is in some ways an admission of shame, of embarrassment, or of failure. It's a confirmation of the disharmony between objects and context. It says that the virtual experience of the cropped photograph is purer and more meaningful than real experience in situ. I think something is deeply wrong when the virtual is somehow better than the real. I think we should take the cropping of images of buildings we have made as a warning sign, as a signal that we have spent our time on something that is overwhelmed by the reality around it. But no cropping is needed when it comes to blocks. Blocks stand up to their surroundings, blocks shape their context, and blocks are a context unto themselves. And unlike larger patterns of urban form, districts, neighborhoods, and so on, the building of urban blocks need not involve a vast consensus that endures over generations, and it need not involve the mysterious workings of history. Blocks can be straightforward projects, like buildings. One sponsor, one architect, one source of funds, one set of decisions, one permit, all at one time. So, students, pay attention, because if dealing with the city at the scale of the block, may be your easiest and your best chance to spend your lifetime as a world shaper in the 21st century. And you probably wouldn't be here unless you harbored some ambitions along those lines. Understanding blocks, I think, requires the opposite of cropping. Blocks are best understood by aerial views, either drawn or photographed. It's a frame which is larger than perspective, larger than the eye looking. It involves the mind as well as the gaze, the cartographer's intelligence added to what is merely pictorial. It's an understanding that requires additions to daily experience, not subtractions from it. The urban block is the building block of the regenerative city. It's an element of its language, like grammar, and like grammar, one must master it to be fluent. Part of this study of urban grammar is to see how the story of the urban block, or the absence of anything resembling an urban block, has played out in cities where sprawl, erasure, or regeneration have been dominant. I'll start our journey round and round the block with Paris, and use Paris as an example of a place where planners thought that sprawl was a fine idea, and they've thought that for some very good reasons. In the 1920s and the 1930s and 40s, Paris flirted with the idea of erasing itself, like an elegant girl flirting with heroin or suicide. Like the elegant girl who decided her fancy life wasn't so bad, Paris thought better of it. Paris has remained herself with a vengeance, and only the most perverse would argue that the world isn't better for Paris remaining Paris. But things might have easily turned out differently if Hitler, Le Corbusier, or any number of other madmen had had their way. I don't think there have ever been mad women who seriously considered the destruction of Paris. But what if General von Koltitz had not summoned the courage to lie to Hitler when he was asked the famous question, "Is Paris burning?" And what if anyone else had taken Le Corbusier's Plan Voisin to replace the historic center of Paris with a grid of identical high-rises as seriously as Le Corbusier took it himself? Hitler and Le Corbusier were not the only people to propose the razing of Paris. French fascination with New York skyscrapers in the 1920s led to a whole series of photomontage fantasies superimposing New York's biggest buildings onto the most precious parts of Paris, with the Arc de Triomphe and L'Étoile here embedded in a photomontage of 1920s and 30s buildings in New York. And here, a New York skyscraper from the 20s, photomontaged next to Notre Dame. In the end, perhaps because these images were so horrific, big new modern buildings were banished to the edge of the city to accommodate the huge office floors for corporate business, manufacturing at the scale of modern industry, and the population influx to the prospering capital. Paris created the satellite of La Défense and the vast environment of the périphérique surrounding the city. These are architectural free fire zones, where the tight bond between the form of buildings and the form of the city is severed completely. That is the most important difference between sprawl and cities. The severed bond is what defines sprawl, and once this bond is severed, the urban block disappears. For 3 glorious centuries, from 1550 to 1850, Paris managed radical changes without severing the bonds among streets, blocks, and buildings. It's the Paris of Henry IV to the Paris of Napoleon III that people write songs about and make movies about and save save for trips for their honeymoon. The culmination of those 3 centuries were a series of magnificent boulevards that Prefect Baron Haussmann inserted into the Paris of Napoleon III, slicing through the medieval fabric of the city. What makes the boulevards of Paris magnificent, however, was the ability of the city to regenerate its tissue around these radical incisions almost immediately. Haussmann's interventions were huge, but they depended upon the action of a legion of very small builder-developers and the virtuosity of their architects to reconcile the public face of the new boulevards with the irregular parcels of land they created. 19th century building programs and 19th century building standards were flexible enough that the repair of blocks was relatively easy and almost instantaneous. But I asked the architects in this audience to imagine what the infill of Haussmann's Paris would have been like if every apartment needed 2 fire exits, an elevator, 1.5 parking spaces, handicapped access, and a prescribed amount of daylight for every room. The reconciliation of building typology and urbanity is a profoundly different, unavoidable, and much, much more complicated game in our day. But the fact remains that Paris, with its tight bond of streets, blocks, and buildings, is beautiful and life-sustaining today. And the périphérique is a horror show where streets and buildings don't even greet one another in passing, and there is no such thing as an urban block. The severed bond between the form of buildings and the form of cities, the form of the city, is one crucial trait that sprawl and erasure share with one another. It's why modern architects are more comfortable with either sprawl or erasure than they are with the regeneration of the historic city. For architects, it's their thinghood thing. The love of thinghood is a unifying theme that stretches across all the multiple generations and multiple isms and sub-isms of the modern movement. It is modern architecture's main idea. Thinghood is somewhat like manhood. It's a point of pride, something to be asserted and defended, something little boys think of as terrific. It's why Rem Koolhaas is fond of saying, "Fuck context." Thinghood, the autonomy and integrity of building form, is the main idea I was taught in architecture school. In itself, it is not something bad, quite the contrary. It's why we revere the buildings of Lucan, of Mies, of Frank Lloyd Wright, of all the modern masters. But with very few exceptions, in very few places, the modern masters never came to terms with the historic city. Instead, they embraced the city of erasure or the city of sprawl, both of which permit the eradication of blocks and the uninflected autonomy and integrity of building form that they believed in so passionately. If Paris represents a kind of purposeful sprawl as the answer to the problem of reconciling the building programs of a modern capital, modern architecture, and the historic city, Beijing is the opposite. A great historic city that decided systematically to erase itself to become modern. At a crucial moment, the planners of Beijing had the same choice as the post-war planners of Paris, and they chose erasure over decentralization or regeneration. So they wiped away the heritage of the city, and they wiped away the culture of the city. There were some thoughtful Chinese architects and planners who believed it didn't have to be that way. Immediately after the 1949 success of the Communist Revolution, China's most eminent architect and architectural historian, trained at the University of Pennsylvania, Liang Xisheng, shown here in the circle, foresaw the pressures of the great imperial capital that the great imperial capital of China would be subjected to if and when China became a modern industrial state. Liang Xisheng is shown here with Le Corbusier and the rest of the international all-star team, of the United Nations building in New York. The story of the life of this prophetic architect who was ignored and then viciously persecuted, his wife literally persecuted to death, is as poignant and as tragic as the story of Beijing itself. Liang proposed preservation of the historic city, converting its magnificent walls to an urban park like the medieval walls of Lucca in Tuscany have been converted to an urban park. And Liang Xicheng proposed constructing a new capital immediately to the west of the historic city. In the early 1990s, as China's fantastic housing boom was getting started, Liang Xicheng's protege, Wu Lianglong, built a beautiful prototype for urban regeneration of the residential fabric of Beijing, the Jewel Air Hutong. This lovely project combined two local traditions, the courtyard house and the hutong, or residential lane, into a dense, thoroughly practical, thoroughly livable new pattern. It was built and then ignored, as China has eradicated its cities and replaced them with literally hundreds of millions of new housing units, built an endless mile after endless mile of slab blocks devoid of any trace or memory of the urban life of Chinese cities. The Beijing Olympics were a culmination of more than 50 years of urban reconstruction through massive expropriation and willful eradication of an ancient and magnificent urban structure. Fortunately, there is at least one beautiful movie, and there are several books that document the physical place and the way of life that were systematically eradicated. I think you can say that the culmination of that culmination occurred during the Olympics on worldwide television in the last minutes of both the men's and the women's marathons. Then what was done, why it was done, what it is like, were visible in the most dramatic fashion to the whole world. Anyone who's ever run a full 26.2-mile marathon knows how the last mile or two can take on the quality of a nightmare, where you're attempting to move your lactosis-frozen body through space, and the finish line keeps receding like a rainbow. Maybe the winners of marathons don't experience that nightmare, but the other competitors who have raced to exhaustion do. In Beijing, the city planners multiplied the nightmare at the end of the marathon 1,000-fold, and they democratized the nightmare by making sure that everyone, not just marathon runners, after the Olympics can have a taste of what it is like to move your body through space that has lost all dimension, spatial or temporal, including the record of city life that flourished there for 1,000 years. Herzoge de Morin's spectacular bird's nest, the main symbol of the Beijing Olympics, is where the marathons finally ended. The approach to the bird's nest, the space created to frame that icon in splendid isolation on worldwide television, formed the last mile and a half of the marathon route. It is a totally vacant expanse of paving where recently tens of thousands of people played out their lives in a dense historic neighborhood. An ant crossing a runway at O'Hare Airport has more to measure his progress by and more to look at than those runners struggling the last mile and a half to the bird's nest. If in the name of progress, modernization, and iconic architecture, they have created the ultimate pedestrian dystopia, then perhaps there is something to learn about the consequences of urbanism by erasure. If Beijing is the most extreme form of urban reconstruction by erasure, Hong Kong, between about 1950 and 1995, is the most extreme example of its opposite, intensification by adaptation and regeneration. It's hard to imagine an urban circumstance more intense than Hong Kong. Yet the hyperdensity of Hong Kong was built on the urban form, the map, of a fishing village. New building typologies emerged to adapt new economic conditions to the existing structure of streets, lots, and blocks. They developed their own fire codes and their own construction techniques to build tall high-rises on the tiny, sometimes irregular blocks of the fishing village. As an intricate network of life-sustaining public spaces in a spectacular natural setting, Hong Kong is without equal. Hong Kong changed radically, but as it changed, it became more Hong Kong-like and more interesting. Hong Kong didn't lose its soul, as Beijing did. Perhaps the most interesting and complex case of all is New York. The New York of the teens and 20s was like Hong Kong, home to the newly invented skyscraper and the site of radical regeneration with great works like the Chrysler and Empire State Buildings built within the block structure of the New York City grid. The final achievement of that era was a masterpiece of the regenerative city, Rockefeller Center, which opened a new world of spatial imagination and monumentality within the old block structure in its mid-blocks. After Rockefeller Center came the era of Euromodernism, ushered in by the new Museum of Modern Art and by Harvard, and the era of Robert Moses, 35 years of erasure of New York's block structure as brutal as that of Beijing. Robert Moses was the man. Then in 1961, Jane Jacobs came along and slew the mighty dragon. Nobody in our office had the Photoshop skills to get Moses off of the, but anyway, the next generation of this lecture will have that. Jane Jacobs began a new era of regeneration starting in the 1960s, and it continues to this day. And it includes New York's most recent buildings, the Time Warner Building and the reconstruction of Columbus Circle, Norman Foster's somewhat Batman-like Hearst Tower, and Renzo Piano's Morgan Library, which I think is a small masterpiece of urbanism that I will use as a segue to our own work. The Morgan Library is not only an exquisitely detailed modern building, it's an act of block repair that links together a series of historic buildings and provides a new public space as a poetic homage to the special character that only occurs in the middle of New York blocks. By framing and honoring that character and putting the life of the library in a glass pavilion in the middle of the block, it makes us see the beauty and the vitality of New York in a new way. To me, this is just an inspiring project. Let me begin with some of our work. In 1989, God gave to San Francisco the mixed blessing of the Loma Prieta earthquake. The Loma Prieta earthquake did some terrible damage, and it did some fabulously good damage, wrecking beyond repair two of the city's most disruptive and stupidly conceived elevated freeways. The Central Freeway that tore through Hayes Valley and destroyed the vista in front of Arthur Brown's magnificent City Hall, which I think I can point at from here, and the Embarcadero Freeway, which cut off the city from the bay. We were the urban designers for the repair of the Central Freeway Corridor, and we are architects for sites in both the Central Freeway Corridor and for the parcel where the infamous Embarcadero Freeway ripped into the historic neighborhood of North Beach. I think these projects are urban regeneration and repair at its most literal. In the Central Freeway Corridor, we established building typologies and design guidelines that repair all of the blocks that the freeway had shattered. And we are working as architects under our own guidelines for a project called Gough Common in the circle, shown in the circle. And that project is now in working drawings, and when somebody comes up with some money, pretty soon we hope, it will get built. Like a lot of the regeneration projects that I just showed, our new building repairs the context, but it is almost 3 times as dense as the fabric it repairs. The Hayes Valley neighborhood is about 40 units to the acre. This project is 117 units to the acre, plus a full level of retail and commercial space below that. It repairs the block with commercial space. It continues a mid-block lane that we, in a project of ours across the street. So this project of ours from 1992 is here, and then that mid-block lane continues in the block to the south and bisects this project. It shows mid-block court and the mid-block lane, and it is it revisits a legacy of bay-windowed brick mid-rise apartment buildings that are sort of an unnoticed part of San Francisco vernacular that never makes it onto postcards, but I've always thought has been a very handsome and solid part of the city. So three views of this new project. Excuse me. This is the mid-block alley that it fronts on, and the other two are the principal streets. The second of these projects is these freeway repair sites is called Broadway Family Apartments, a new project that we completed a few months ago. And it attempts to do with the very limited program and budget of low-income housing what Renzo Piano did so eloquently with the Morgan Library. That is, capture and organize the space of a mid-block as it repairs the perimeter of a block and knits together the disparate buildings of a block around it. It's built at the edge of the Northeast Waterfront Historic District, and it has a kind of literal contextualism, rigidly, but I think not inappropriately, imposed by the San Francisco Landmarks Commission. Our building is the one on the left here, and an earlier brick office building by Gensler. The two of these form a kind of gateway to the North Beach neighborhood from the waterfront. So the matching of the height, matching of the materials, and relating to that pre-existing building across the street was very much part of the design idea. I'll go quickly through a few of these images. And then there's a network of spaces that go through the block from the lobby, the entrance lobby, out the lobby to an access through two courtyards, ending up in another lobby on the other end of the site where there's a little child care place outside a laundry, tenants' laundry, and children play in this little place that we made. And then there are these two courtyards, one for daycare. An important aspect of this, I think, is the glimpses of the city, the framed city, from everywhere in the project. I think that contextualism works in two directions, both that this is part of the city fabric, and then when you're in it, your sense of being a part of the city and being located in the city, in its views and in its urban fabric, is as important as the view from outside. I was very struck last night by the beautiful new architecture building in Portland, and with the sense of being part of the neighborhood in the building as much as the building fitting in the neighborhood from outside. You really feel like the district and the interior of the building are one and the same. And I think we tried to accomplish that, a similar idea with this. For a very long time, for more than 30 years, I think a principal source of my design ideas for San Francisco has been the original surveys of the city as they were laid out in 1847, 49, and 51. And I'm very indebted in this part of my career to the scholarship of Anne-Vernée Moudon, who wrote about San Francisco when we were teaching together more than 30 years ago. These surveyors' maps were so fundamental in establishing the character of the city that any architect who cares about the city and that character, I think, needs to know something about these maps. The Tenvara lot, the subdivision of the city grid, generated or was co-generated with the original building typologies of the San Francisco row house. And that character of narrow lots stepping up and down the hills really is the texture and fabric of San Francisco. And then the subdivision of those blocks with mid-block lanes or alleys and with mid-block courtyards are so much the quality and the charm of the city, the subscale established by the original builders and to some degree by the original surveyors. We are just finishing a project with the unfortunate marketeer's name of Mosaica in the Mission District of San Francisco. And the Mission District is one of these places that is sort of like the Pearl District in Portland. It's a place where the original structure of the city is very much intact. It has that characteristic of blocks and subdivision of blocks by lanes and building typologies that are related to the original platting. And it's a robust mix of about everything you can imagine. Poor people, yuppies, artisans, clubs, places to eat. It is a very cool and very lively part of the city. When one gets a chance to build a project in a neighborhood like this, almost always it is on a site that was aggregated and where the original map was wiped away. So this is a project that where the site was a block that was aggregated as a bus storage yard. And when one gets a project like this, it's almost always for a program that doesn't fit and could not fit in the old block structure. So contextualism, if one believes in such a thing, does not happen automatically. You get a site where the context is wiped away, and you get a program in which won't fit in the old context. This site was very hotly contested turf. It was a sort of political hot potato. There were many different people and many groups who had their own ideas about what should happen to it. All of them were passionate about preserving the character of the neighborhood, although they didn't all agree on what that was. And all of them were highly skeptical that a big new project could be a good thing. So we led this is the site with this bus yard with a whole artist cooperative across the street, and then you see in the background some of the scale of this neighborhood, which is very small buildings. So we led and in the end had a remarkably congenial neighborhood process in which we hammered out the program with the mayor's office, the developers, and lots of neighbors. And after multiple alternatives, we arrived at a block configuration that seemed to make everyone happy. But by the time everyone in the neighborhood liked the program, it contained this incredibly complicated mix of things with a patchwork of equally complicated funding. 93 units of low-income family rental apartments, shown in the orange, 24 apartments for formerly homeless seniors, 21 subsidized ownership units, which are at the upper right corner, excuse me, this thing up here, and 13 market rate ownership units. And most interestingly, 11,500 square feet of, which is shown in the darker color at the lower floor, of subsidized space for artisans, non-retail, non-residential space, as really a gesture for the preservation of blue-collar employment in the mission. Getting all that program on the site and making the buildings fit within the budget of a subsidized housing tax credit budget requires a very simple double-loaded corridor building with stacked flats, which with no manipulation would be completely out of character with the delicate, funky, subdivided Mission District. There are two design ideas that both come from the old city maps that I think make this project work. First is the development of the mid-block space. There's a publicly accessible new lane that passes under the buildings and through the block. That's this. This is 19th Street and 18th Street, and we've named this 18.5 Street as it goes through the block and under the buildings. And then there are two courtyards on top of half-level down parking that are private, or they're common to the project, common space, but gated and private from the street. So gated, raised courtyard, lane, gate, raised courtyard, street. The block under construction, original renderings. Oh, excuse me, I didn't talk about the second of the two ideas. The other idea is something that is a way of articulating these buildings, but kind of unit plan that we call a nested bedroom, and it's a unit plan that tucks one bedroom behind another. That does two things. It shortens the amount of perimeter that a unit takes, which is the way that we could get the density on the site. The second thing it does is it takes a big, long building and it articulates it vertically in a way that is more than skin deep, so that the architecture can change with each of these segments in a way that has some echo of the subdivided blocks around it. It's a little bit of a tricky game to do that and have it not come out as a completely superficial applique of architectural expression, but I think we made it work. The mid-block lane in its rendering, the mid-block lane almost complete. These are pretty crude construction photographs, but I think they give the idea. The artisans' workshops with glass garage doors so that people can drive trucks up to these things and actually work both inside and outside in this lane. The passage from the mid-block lane up to the courtyards. The southern courtyard play space and the stoops leading to ground floor units from the courtyard. The southern view as it's completed, almost completed, and the streetscape with this vertical articulation where different segments of the building are different colors and have somewhat different detailing, although this is really one big, long, double-loaded corridor, a stacked flat building going almost 2 blocks. And then some manipulations of program, like putting 4-bedroom units on top of 2-bedroom units in order to create a loggia on top of the artisan's workspace below. And over the portal into the mid-block lane, 2 laundry rooms that share this double-height exterior space as a kind of recreation space outside the laundries. The sociologist, Harvard professor, and writer, former Harvard professor, Nathan Glazer, has produced a kind of uneven book of essays, but some interesting ones, called From a Movement to a Style, in which he talks about how modern architecture has lost its way. In the most interesting of these essays, he discusses how revolutionary formal and technological ideas about buildings were once rooted in broad themes of remaking society after the catastrophe of World War I. And he talks about how those same formal ideas and enthusiasms have devolved into intellectual and stylistic chic. He talks about the confusion of architecture with art and the distortion of art by Marxist aesthetic theory. He sees architecture consumed by the culture of an avant-garde that can only survive in a posture of perpetual disdain for society and for the cities it builds. His argument explains the hostility contained in the pithy epigram, fuck context. I'd like to think of the last project I'll show, which is the David Brower Center, Oxford Plaza in Berkeley, which we're just completing, as an opportunity to take the history that Nathan Glazer talks about and put it on rewind, at least for this one discrete piece of work, and to put the formal language of modernism back to work on big themes. Neither the big themes nor the formal language of these buildings are anything like a personal invention of mine, nor should they be. That, I think, is a part of the point. So what are the themes? At the risk of sounding insufferably compass. I'm going to list the themes that for me make it worthwhile and interesting to go through all the bother of being an architect at the beginning of the 21st century. They are, 1, repairing and regenerating urban centers. 2, nurturing environmentalism and helping to create the post-oil society and city. And 3, housing the urban poor and integrating them into the economic and cultural mainstream. The David Brower Center is an extraordinary opportunity to touch on all of that. It is right at the edge of Berkeley downtown, where the sort of the raggedy edge of Berkeley's downtown meets the UC campus, and across the street from a magnificent building from the 20s, the track stadium called Edwards Stadium, which will shortly be revealed when there's a funny little building right here that will be torn down, and our David Brower Center / Oxford Plaza, which is the housing piece of it, and Edwards Stadium together will form a new public space which will be the sculpture garden for the University Art Museum, which is going to be built 2 blocks away. The program for the Brower Center is even more complicated than Mosaica. It's a mixed-use program, and the funding is also as complicated as the program. It's 30,000 square feet of a 30,000 square foot office building for environmental nonprofits as a kind of showcase for them. It's a conference center with a theater on 2 levels, with a theater, meeting rooms, an upper meeting room, and a gallery and a generous lobby, and a series of support spaces for the environmental nonprofits. It's a restaurant, 8,500 square feet of retail, parking for housing, 96 units, of low-income family housing, and a city parking garage underneath the whole thing. It's the most complicated puzzle of figuring out how to putting all that on this irregular site, dealing with the issues of outlook and privacy for the housing in relation to the office building, and trying to make this a LEED Platinum project. This seems to wash out completely from where I'm standing, but it shows the David Brower Center housing, the conference center, and then 3 mid-block courtyards that link, and then the housing piece, Oxford Plaza. The section, which I won't go into in detail because I'm rambling on too long, the section shows a whole series of environmental systems developed with an extraordinary consulting team of people, of the very best people I've ever worked with. There's mechanical engineers, daylighting engineers, acoustical engineers, fabulous structural engineer, to make a super green building. Green in many ways, one of which is structural. Built out of high slag concrete, which is much, the greenest form of concrete, with a highly ductile, not only building frame, but building skin, designed for a building that is sitting almost on top of the Hayward earthquake fault, so that its interior finishes, as well as its contents, will survive a major seismic event. And then there's systems for, there is hydronic radiant heating in the slab, there's displacement ventilation from a raised floor, there's a series of different daylighting strategies for the north and the south of the building, actually different on each floor, but designed so that on most normal days you don't even need task lighting, even at the back of any of the office spaces. And also designed for power generation, where what functions as a sunshade on the south of the building also carries a photovoltaic rack, and as that wraps to the north of the building, it flips in the other direction. So on the north of the building, it has this south-facing photovoltaic rack also. And the architecture is really the expression of all those systems, of the daylighting devices, the power generation, the structural frame, and so on. So I'll go through images of this. I won't say much about the individual images. But what I think it shows is that interest in what I've called the big themes does not imply lack of interest or lack of respect for the formal inventions of modern architecture. I'm different from many of my new urbanist friends in this regard. At the Brower Center, there are echoes of a lot of modern architecture. There are echoes of Hans Scharoun and Eric Mendelsohn. There's echoes of the great English green architect Michael Hopkins, whom I respect as deeply as Michael Hopkins respects Lou Kahn. There are architectural echoes at the Brower Center because my colleagues and I believe that the heritage of modern architecture is a fine dancing partner for the three big themes. There's plenty of examples of modern architecture stomping on the feet of those themes with buildings that are elitist or buildings that are anti-environmental, and most particularly for buildings that are anti-urban. But I believe that kind of foot-stomping modernism is a betrayal of its original premise and a betrayal of its continuing promise. Being a lifelong student of architecture, loving its history, even its recent history, is not or should not be in conflict with thinking about the world and what is happening to it. If one is a learned architect or learned student of architecture, one eventually knows enough to draw upon that long, long heritage of buildings and cities, and then perhaps one really has something to offer. Thinking of that long heritage, thinking of my own pleasure in the immersion in it, thinking of the name I've given to this talk, Round and Round the Block, and thinking of you, who are all at some point in your study of that heritage, I'll end with a quote of a quote. Igor Stravinsky, who was no creative slouch, liked to repeat a great sentence from Goethe, who was also no slouch, and who said, "Everything has been thought of before. The task is to think of it again." Thank you. Yep. They're cheap buildings. Yeah, well, I mean, not entirely. The David Brower Center is not a cheap building. The housing component of it, the Oxford Plaza piece, is within the same cost guidelines as any other low-income housing tax credit subsidized project. The Broadway family apartments, because of the really tough political opposition to having low-income housing on that site from a lot of neighbors and from the Neighborhood Association and the Landmarks Board, the Mayor's Office of Housing sprung for, I think, I forget what it was, $200,000 to do brick cladding on the mid-rise piece. And it's not real brick cladding, it really is thin brick it's just brick veneer on stucco with enough real brick and enough careful detailing to make the sleight of hand not obvious. It really does look like a brick building. But with the exception of the David Brower Center, which also was built to a very tough budget, all of these are just really basic stuff. I mean, they're not expensive buildings at all, this group. Pardon me? They are private nonprofits. They're all private nonprofits. But it's public money. The David Brower Center has some private money in it, some philanthropy in it. All the rest of them are publicly funded. Yep. Well.
I really applaud the urban qualities of these blocks, the idea of the block. And this is what cities need. The ability to redevelop these and everything. I appreciate sort of a reflection, having the kind of title of the Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not as talented as Maybeck or Julia Morgan. I mean, or as well trained. I think that, you know, I'm the product of pretty straight-ahead modernist education. I have my own formal skills, and they only go so far. I think that it has landed me as, you know, it's sort of created for me a career of doing city fabric. And I think that city fabric shouldn't shout too hard, and shouldn't be too amusing, and shouldn't be as self-referential as foreground buildings should be. I think the Brower building, in its program and its symbolism, deserves to be a foreground building. And I think it's somewhat different from the others. But I think that there is a great career and a great life in making buildings that are the normative fabric of the city. To me, that is endlessly fascinating. And you know, I think that there are a lot of people in the new urbanist camp who are revivalists, who want to revive the training and skills that were the skills of the Beaux-Arts. It is the curriculum at Notre Dame to try to teach people to do that. I think that the people who come out of Notre Dame and do revivalist buildings are in a perpetual conflict with the building technology that they're working with. And I think that to the degree that our work is successful, I think we've really mastered hardy plank, you know, and textured drywall, and, you know, and thin brick veneer, you know, and all this crap we get to build out of, and without having a kind of conflict between the stylistic aspirations and what you have to make it out of. I don't know if that's an answer for you.
One of the folks in the Bay Area, for example, I look at David Baker's work, right?
Yeah.
Fairly well.
Yeah.
He's, I think, younger than you are a little bit.
Not much.
Not much. We're all the same, Dan.
Yeah.
Again, there's another sort of.
Yeah, it's a different.
How do you know, there's a bunch of you that it stalwarts the needs of the community, the fabric of the community.
I respect David Baker's work a lot. We compete all the time, and we are, you know, we're the Carmen Basilio and Kid Gavilan of, we're on our 50th rematch. You know. His work is stylistically quite different from ours, and I think his work is stylistically more consistent. If that's good or bad, I'm not sure, but his buildings look more a lot like one another than ours do. And you know, it's a different hand. It's a slightly different, and I think in his part, very skillful hand at the same kinds of programs and the same kinds of settings. And I think that David, and I like to think the same about myself and our office, have evolved a lot over the years. I mean, actually, we're competing for a site on which there is a 35-year-old David Baker building, tiny little building, about 600 square feet. And man, has he improved in 30 years. Yeah. Hope we have too. Hope I have too. Yep.
A lot of the examples you showed, they talk about, or they have a fabric outcome which you respond. The examples you show, they have a fabric around them to which
Yeah.
you respond.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice on repairing or recreating urban fabric where it has been erased or is in its very early stages of infancy?
That's really hard. You know, I think we have. I find it much easier to respond to something than to work from whole cloth on a green field. We're currently working in a town called Hercules, which was one of the most egregious examples of sprawl that got religion with a Dover Coal master plan in the early 90s, and has slowly been, since then, becoming a sort of new urbanist town in a pretty historicist, somewhat stage-setty way. But we've just been given, or we're currently working on, a big empty place, which they want to have be the downtown Main Street. And I didn't bring that project tonight. Part of it is nearing construction, and part of it is still in the master planning stage. But I found that really hard, not to have a site where there was nothing to grab onto, except create de novo a piece of city. Whether in the end, when that is built, it seems really artificial, or whether it seems like it's rooted there, it to me is a real adventure. I don't know whether it's like jumping off a cliff and seeing if where you land. So ask me in a year or a year and a half when the first piece is built, whether the attempt to do that comes off or not. I'm quite worried about it, actually. Yeah.
You make a very cogent argument about the connection of the street, the block, and the building. But I was just reading this J.D. Jackson, A Sense of Place and A Sense of Time, where it describes how America has a different sense of kind of cities as being condensed and kind of coming together, rather than kind of the European sense of enclosure with the streets and the blocks. So when I saw your images of Hong Kong and Beijing, I was thinking, well, in Hong Kong there's this really different sense about what is the block and how you experience the city. And I was just wondering what your thought is about these kind of new communities where they create a kind of urbanism using artificial podiums. Do you think there's a possibility that there could be another form of urban life that's sort of European prototype that we all got so much inherently from?
Yeah, I mean, I think that LA is a pretty interesting city, and it's certainly urban, and it sustains amazing urban culture. It's weird. It's not, I come from San Francisco, which really is a European city. I mean, it's a transplanted European city, and it's what I'm comfortable in. I'm certainly comfortable in Portland. But the interesting thing, the places that I just find really troubling about American cities are also characteristic American cities: Las Vegas, Atlanta, Phoenix. The real Sunbelt sprawl cities. That, and I'm sort of lost in those places. I don't know what to do there. I wouldn't know how to be an architect there. I wouldn't ever want to live there. It's also interesting that they have led the way into this recession, that the housing collapse, the collapse of value is in the non-urban cities. It's Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Atlanta, not Boston, San Francisco, New York, Portland, that have created this economic calamity. I think there's something more than a coincidence in that I don't completely understand, but I think it's an interesting phenomenon. Yeah. Yeah. That it?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.